Professor Wise Guy here, talking about the beginnings of steampunk. Not exactly, but sort of. In 1954, Disney made a film based on Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And many people think that film and its design and especially the submarine, the Nautilus, is one of the origins of the steampunk aesthetic. Well, I don't want to talk necessarily about steampunk. I want to talk about this third Jules Verne novel. Actually, I say third, it's the third video I'm making, but it's between the other two. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was serially published in 1869 and 70, and then published as an entire book in 1871. If you're not familiar with serial publication, it was not put in a box of Frosted Flakes. No, it means that it came out in perhaps a chapter in each issue of a magazine over a period of years. Most of Charles Dickens' books were first published serially. That is, you'd read a chapter this month and you wait for next month. And so it helps to explain why things were divided the way they were. It was a very common thing in the 19th century. It's pretty well fallen out of use today. Now, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. First question, how much is a league? What is a league, and why in the world would that be a unit of measurement? Well, a league is roughly 3.6 miles, and it is considered what a fit adult can walk in the course of an hour. You move at a decent pace if you're going 3.6 miles an hour, but that's what a league was. It's actually a measurement that has different definitions in different places, but that's a pretty good one, 3.6, 3.5 miles. So 20,000 leagues under the sea means it is roughly 70,000 miles under the sea. Doesn't mean 70,000 miles down. We'd run out of Earth by that. No, it's 70,000 miles traveled beneath the ocean's waves. All right. Now, in this book, we find, not surprisingly, some of the same sorts of characters that we have in Jules Verne's other extraordinary journey novels. The narrator is Professor Aronnax, who in the 1954 film was played by the Oscar-winning Hungarian actor Paul Lukas. He is assisted by a servant, Conseil. Well, you know, like Passepartout in Around the World, and to some degree, like Axel in Journey to the Center of the Earth, these are sort of obsequious servants who will just do anything. They don't really question their leader. Axel questions a little bit more, but he still goes along when any sensible person would not. Conseil is a ridiculously obedient servant, and he never speaks of his master, his word, except in the third person. So he never says you, he always refers to him in the third person. And then we have a third main character, Ned Land, a harpooner, who is very similar in ways to Hans in Journey to the Center of the Earth. There's no duck involved here, but there was no duck with Hans in the Jules Verne version either. Now, this is a novel that was just basically made for Hollywood. It was made for adaptation to the big screen. I mean, you get submarines, and you get special effects, and you get sea monsters, and you get diving, and all sorts of cool things. And so it was created as a film in 1954. That's the most famous. We have Kirk Douglas as the star. We have James Mason as Captain Nemo, and other. Oh, Peter Lorre is Conseil. You know, Peter Lorre. You despise me, don't you, Rick? Yeah, it's my Peter Lorre. Now, what can we say about this book? Well, one of the things I would notice if I were looking at print editions of Journey to the Center of the Earth and Around the World in 80 Days and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is that 20,000 Leagues is considerably longer. It's almost twice as long as those other two works. Why? Is it a lot more story? Well, not really. I mean, they go all the way around the world, around the world in 80 days, right? They go to the center of the Earth, and then they come back. So 20,000 Leagues shouldn't necessarily be longer, but you have Jules Verne basically, in my opinion, dumping out all of the considerable research he did in the flora and fauna of the ocean, and then B, the workings of the Nautilus, which shouldn't have worked according to the technology of the mid-1800s, but he explains how it does in a conjectural way, but he goes into so much detail and of the sea creatures and the way that they harvest the sea plants in order to eat them and all. He goes into extraordinary detail. I don't know how many lists of all the different types of fish they see are in the book, but there are many of them. And honestly, I think if you took out some of that stuff, a lot of that stuff, you could probably knock the book down by 20% and really not lose very much. Now, I mention this because it's one of the first things that makes me compare this book with Moby Dick. Now, we don't have a white whale in Moby Dick, but we do have some similarities. Moby Dick comes out in the 1850s. This comes out in the 1870. You have a monomaniacal captain, Captain Nemo, over here. You have Captain Ahab over here. You have a crew, and specifically in this case, the professor and Ned Land and Conseil over here, who are sort of held against their will. They're not completely willing participants. They are literally held where you have Ishmael and Quig over here, who are held because they signed on to this ill-chosen whaling expedition. They're all, I think, but especially those main characters, thinking, what have we gotten ourselves into? On the other hand, in both cases, we have other members of the crew who are completely drinking the Kool-Aid. They are buying in to what Captain Nemo or Captain Ahab are selling. They are not worried about anything bad happening. Minor detail, but we have a harpooner as a main character in Ned Land over here and Quig over here. All right, so there are those comparisons, but the thing that really got my attention was in Moby Dick, there are frequent chapters that explain how things are done on a whaling ship. And many people find those tedious. I mean, if you really, really want to know about whaling, okay. But if you really want to read a story about whaling, you don't need to know in great detail how they rendered the actually how they first cut off the blubber of a whale and then rendered it down and eventually made whale oil out of it. You just don't need to know that. There are scholars who will work very hard to try to explain why those are essential parts of the novel. I disagree. I think that Melville said, I know all this stuff, I'm going to put it in there. And I think it's one of the reasons why the book was not terribly successful at the beginning. You can read through, and I've read it both ways. You can read through the novel of Moby Dick and skip over those chapters, and I don't think you miss much. Similarly, I think you could skip over the long lists of sea creatures and the long explanations of how different things worked, which may or may not have actually worked. You can do that and it wouldn't really hurt anything. Now, both of those other novels, Around the World and Journey to the Center of the Earth, They both do a little bit of this, turn it to the center of the earth. Notably does a lot of talk about geological strata and theories about that, but I think it does it in a way that's integral to the story, and it just doesn't go on in great depth. With 20,000 Leagues, I found myself several times just saying, would you just move on? So that's my criticism. Is there anything good about it? Well, there are some really interesting things, I think, about it. First of all, you have, again, the typical 19th century attitude toward people of a certain social rank. The professor is a professor. You know, he's highly educated. He's to be taken, and he's not just highly educated, but he has contributed to the maritime understandings. You know, he is a scholar of the stuff that fascinates Captain Nemo. Nemo, who is, we eventually find out, a royal, basically from East India, you know, two upper class guys, and they are both taken very seriously. We have the obsequious servant in Conseil, just as we had obsequious servants in the previous books. We have the sort of the rude mechanical, the strong man in the harpooner Ned Land, and you know he's noteworthy, but he's kind of foolish. He works by brawn and not brain. So there is a typical 19th century attitude being shown there, but there are some really interesting things, I think. What motivates Captain Nemo? Well, he just has no use for the things that people do on land. He is really worked up about imperialism, and specifically the British Empire. He is really opposed to the way that people are misusing the earth. What would Jules Verne have said had he written this 100 years later? How much more upset would Captain Nemo have been had this come later? Well, I don't know. This is like a proto-environmental take on the world. And the critique of imperialism and the misuse of natural resources is not something you saw very much in those early books. You get a little bit of this in James Fenimore Cooper and the Leatherstocking Tales, but the idea of somebody absolutely isolating himself from humanity. If you're not with me as an undersea person, I've got no use for you. I don't think we see that before this. And again, what would Captain Nemo, as seen through the eyes of Jules Verne, what would he think 100 years later or 150 years later with the environmental situation of today? I don't know. Is this book worth reading? Yeah, it is, despite the fact that it has those long lists of sea creatures that you could live without. Skim over them if you want. It is a good book, an intriguing book. You know, if I really had one complaint other than those unnecessary bits, it's that we knew from the beginning that the professor was apparently going to escape from the Nautilus, right? Because he's the narrator. It's like Journey to the Center of the Earth. Is Axel going to survive? Well, if he doesn't, how is he going to be our narrator? So we knew that the professor was somehow going to get his message out, at least, and yet we still read on. We wondered how he was going to escape or get his message out. And yet we don't find out exactly. We know when they start their escape, then the professor is unconscious, and we don't get any. We got details about everything, but we don't get any details about this. And no, he's just out, and that's okay. We also, though, and I think this was intentional, we don't know what happened to the Nautilus. In that crucial moment, did the Nautilus survive or did it not? That's not entirely clear, and I think that's probably why Jules Verne made this choice, so that he couldn't say for sure, here's what happened to Nemo, and he then had the ability to bring him back if he wanted to. So that's all I've got on this one. I hope you will enjoy this novel. might want to see that 1954 Disney version, which is pretty good. Again, James Mason as Nemo, Kirk Douglas as the professor. It works, and there's no duck. All right, that's all from here. Get out of here.